Of this SAND conference is the emergent universe. And during this session and our longer session, we'll be discussing your emergence embryologically and the resultant fluid ocean within you. My name is Mauro Zappaterra. I have all my degrees listed above there. I did my MD PhD at Harvard Medical School. I also studied polarity therapy, craniosacral therapy, and Reiki during that time period. I now have a private practice in Pasadena, California, where I practice physical medicine and rehabilitation, and I work at the Los Angeles VA healthcare system. The title of my talk is The Cerebrospinal Fluid, Connecting to the I Am. The I Am, to me, is that inner sense of beingness, your perception, your inner perception of your existence. And I love that Maurizio gave the introduction of how this talk was inspired, and if you come to the longer talk, you'll see more inspirations. Numerous artists have depicted our energetic bodies manifesting as physical form. Many times there appears a vortex or some sort of swirling energy with a condensation or differentiation of that energy from some source energy to a focal point in the center of your brain. This presentation will be on the embryonic fluids and the cerebrospinal fluid as a potential conveyor of this energy to our physical bodies. In your brain right now, this is a fact, there are fluid-filled cavities. These are called ventricles. At the center of your brain, at the same location of your third eye, your brow center, there's a cavity called the third ventricle. The third ventricle is an exact midline space. Its boundaries are the pituitary gland in front and the pineal gland in back. The thalamus and the hypothalamus on the sides. The space in between these structures, in this space, has been called the Crystal Palace by Taoists and the Cave of Brahma in some Hindu yogic traditions. This space is filled with fluid. It is the cerebrospinal fluid. What is the cerebrospinal fluid? The cerebrospinal fluid is a clear fluid that bathes the brain and the spine. It occupies the cavities within the brain called ventricles, seen here. It covers the outside of the brain, anything that you see in blue. It also travels down the central canal of your spinal cord. In your spinal cord, you have a central canal. It's a hollow tube. It goes all the way down. And it also bathes the outside of your spinal cord. In each of you right now, you have 150 milliliters of cerebrospinal fluid right now in your body. It turns over 3 to 4 times a day. You produce this much CSF in one day. Here's a sagittal or side view of an MRI of an adult human. The CSF is colored in red. From this image, you can see how it bathes the entire outside of the brain, as well as the spaces inside, and the entire outside of the spinal cord. Our central nervous system is floating in and being bathed by this fluid. Interestingly, the cerebrospinal fluid goes all the way down to the sacrum, but the spinal cord ends at what we call lumbar vertebrae 2. Just keep this in mind for future slides. Where does this fluid come from? This is you, this little black spot. Right there. That was you, each and every one of you, as an embryo. You see the amniotic fluid on the top, you see the yolk sac, and you see the chorionic fluid. Look at how you are essentially developing, surrounded by fluid, enclosed in fluid, and totally supported by fluid in your embryologic development. You were organized and created by fluid. So where is the CSF? The CSF comes from the amniotic fluid through a process called neurulation. And I'm going to point here. Okay? There's a sheet of cells called the neural plate. The amniotic fluid is on the outside. This sheet of cells undergoes what's called an invagination. The invagination forms what's called a neural groove with neural folds on the outside. Those neural folds essentially fuse And now the CSF is enclosed inside that cavity, and the amniotic fluid is on the outside. So there's a differentiation that occurs from the amniotic fluid to create the cerebrospinal fluid. Your brain and spinal cord was organized around this fluid. This is a scanning electron microscope image of a developing mouse, as if you are floating in the amniotic fluid. So you're watching the mouse in the amniotic fluid. Here you see the neural folds developing. They become more and more slender. There's a more clear invagination. And then, if you look here at 16S, what you see here is that some of the folds have fused, but there's this space that's still open. That space is essentially where it still hasn't fused yet. So you can still have mixture of the amniotic fluid and the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? And then, once it's fused in 19S, you get no more mixture. So the amniotic fluid is on the outside, and the cerebrospinal fluid is on the inside. Initially, your embryonic brain is a hollow fluid-filled vesicle with cerebrospinal fluid on the inside of the tube and amniotic fluid on the outside of the tube. As you develop, the brain and spinal cord enlarge and differentiate, and the cerebrospinal fluid continues to bathe the inside and outside of your entire central nervous system. So here you are as a tiny little embryo, completely surrounded by fluid. As you start developing awareness as an embryo, you are bathed in this primordial fluid, the amniotic fluid, in your mother's womb. Starting with the amniotic fluid and slowly differentiating into the cerebrospinal fluid. Now in you, in each and every one of you, it bathes your entire central nervous system, inside and outside your brain, traveling all the way down the central canal of your spinal cord, all the way down to your sacrum. So what is the role of the CSF? Let's take a view evolutionarily. It is actually thought that the CSF system evolved as a way to receive signals from the environment required for the functioning of the nervous system. Evolutionarily, brain cells on a starfish in the ocean that make contact with ocean water are very similar to the same cells that are found on the neural plate that I mentioned before. Throughout evolution, as there becomes a closure of the body plan and sort of an internal and external environment begins, such as a sea worm, the cells that are contacting the inside of the sea worm are similar to the cells that actually form the neural tube. In the sea worm, it gets mixture of the external seawater and an internal seawater. There's still that mixing of fluids. Very similar to what I described, the cerebrospinal fluid mixing with the amniotic fluid prior to complete fusion. Evolutionarily, seawater is the first internal fluid environment of the brain. These cells that contact the surrounding fluid have a special role of receiving and transforming information from the fluid, whether that is ocean water like a starfish or CSF invertebrates like you and I. Our ancestral CSF is seawater. So how did I become so fascinated with the CSF? It started looking at this slide. In this section, through the head of a human embryo at 8 weeks of development, you see the developing brain. I did not know what this structure was inside this sort of space, so I asked my colleague who said that was the choroid plexus. Well, the choroid plexus produces CSF. If the structure that produces CSF is so large, I knew that the CSF had to have an important function developing. Our developing nervous system is essentially bathed in this fluid. From our research and other people's research, we can say that the CSF provides essential survival and growth factors to the embryonic and adult brain, and it provides a fluid niche for neural stem cells for survival, proliferation, and differentiation. So from a biological, purely molecular perspective, the information in the CSF, whether that information is coming from a protein, a hormone, a growth factor, or any molecule, is being conveyed to the brain via the fluid. We published an article in the journal Neuron, and we designed the cover image for that based on our vision of the CSF. What you see here is the continuum from an embryo to the adult. This change in color represents the changing proteins that are necessary